the stream. Go to Spooky Scary Skeletons. Go live. Cool. Right. Actually, we'll just go by. We'll go through this at regular speed since this is the one we ended on, and most of y'all were trying to leave, so. Right. And just as a reminder to my online students, if you haven't already sent your paper in, please attach a document to the email to send it in. Shared Google Docs tend to be kind of a pain. If you have to do that, that's fine, but try to make it so I can access it immediately. Right. So, any questions from you guys before we start? I already asked, but I just want to be sure. Okay. As far as the grading on the papers, I'll give them back to you as soon as I can, but I got a lot to do all at once, so it might be a minute. So we ended with this last time, but I want to make sure we go over it clearly, because this is very important for how Britain handles things, especially going into the war itself. So Britain has been focusing elsewhere, and the colonies have been largely left alone. This benign neglect, wherein the colonies have been neglected, but normally neglect is a negative term. But in this case, the colonies have been left alone to such an extent that they've kind of been able to do their own thing. Smuggling and domestic manufacturing can flourish, but also, as we're going to see, they've been ignoring a lot of taxes that Britain has been placing on their other colonies because, again, the British are busy elsewhere. I've got a map in the next chapter that shows the expanse of the British Empire before the American Revolution, and they touch every part of the world. However, George Grenville was appointed by the King in 1763. George Grenville was the Prime Minister of England and also the Chief Executor. Let me see. Executor. I don't know exactly how to pronounce that. Basically, he was in charge of the money, as well as being the Prime Minister, which sort of meant he was in charge of everything anyway. Because again, the king was a constitutional monarch, which meant that he wasn't in charge of everything. He was equal to Parliament. So George Grenville technically was the one with the power here. The king just kind of rubber stamped everything anyway. So George Grenville began setting acts of Parliament through, and I mean, most of these are bookkeeping, you could say. They're just like, hey, these are things that already are on the books, but we're going to make sure that people are reminded. Navigation Acts prohibited smuggling, the thing that's illegal by definition. Established trade guidelines, which I'll get into in a greater detail in a little bit, which is basically just reinforcing mercantilism, which again is something that's already on the books. Quartering Act 1765, keeping troops in the colonies to enforce imperial policy, which we already kind of mentioned before. ensuring that impressment happens, and also to keep smuggling from happening. So again, it was something that's already going on, but this is now an official act of Parliament. This was the big one, the Sugar Act, or the American Duties Act of 1764, an import duty or tax, sugar, coffee, wines, other luxury items, stuff that everybody wants, but it's not necessarily like a need. They're not putting taxes on, bread. But stuff that's already relatively high dollar, get a little extra money off of that. Also made it harder to bring money in from foreign powers, or bring molasses in from foreign powers, because again, that was supposed to not be going on anyway due to the whole mercantilism thing, but that was already going on with the smuggling, so they were just finding different ways to fight that. So all of this was to try to bring money into Great Britain due to the 7 Years' War. Britain had just fought against France and Spain. To a lesser extent, brain fart there, Russia and Austria, though Prussia was the one doing most of that. But it was a big war. It was, a lot of historians like to say, the first true world war, considering it was fought from North America to India and even the Philippines. So, it was a bigger war than just some fighting here in the colonies. So the Committee of Correspondence was established in Massachusetts. They had concerns about these taxes, spread them through speeches, pamphlets, petitions, and then sent these to other leaders in other colonies. But again, the Navigation Acts, the Sugar Act, the Quartering Act, these were things that other colonies, India, Australia, especially Ireland, they had been dealing with for years, and in some cases for centuries, because Britain had always been like right there on top of what was going on. Especially, India not as long, but especially since Britain had been focusing on India, India's been very under the thumb of British administration. And the reason that it was seen as such a big deal here in the North American colonies is because of the benign neglect. Where's my mouse? Over here, over there, there it is. Because of the benign neglect that had been going on for so long, where the colonies had been free of that, and all of a sudden it's all hitting at once. You could say the boiled frog analogy, where rather than things are going a little at a time, it's all hitting at once, and we're like, oh, where'd all this come from? It's like, well, everybody else is dealing with it. Anyway, there's George Grenville. Figured I'd get an image of him. And as I said, the Navigation Acts were really just to enforce mercantilism. Tobacco was sent to England. Cargo was sent to England to be taxed before it went to the colonies. Nothing could be exported except to England, and no manufactured goods could be exported because all manufactured goods were being created in England. So again, this was just mercantilism. This was just that thing we've already talked about, but written directly into an act. Oh, right. So the response to George Grenville and these various acts, especially the Sugar Act, were very calm and measured. You know, we have here the Committee of Correspondence and their concerns, um, having speeches and pamphlets and whatnot, and sending them to the other colonies. You know, nobody rioted in the streets and hanged effigies of Grenville and wrote "The Folly of England" and "The Ruin of America," and like looks like they're also burning an effigy of Grenville there in the back. Like there was Boston was weird, man. Real intense. And by comparison, England saw them as just a bunch of backcountry idiots. So, um, while that was enough to get the colonists annoyed, um, later acts actually cause proper resistance. So we have the Stamp Act. This is actually like the next section in the book. So this is a proper new section. The Stamp Act, revenue stamp, all transactions involving paper, newspapers, contracts, playing cards, diplomas. Contracts include marriage certificates, death certificates, birth certificates, like anything involving paper. There was an extra little tax to it. Now, the thing about the Stamp Act is that the money for this act was specifically meant to be used to protect the colonies, because again, as we saw earlier in the chapter, the expanse of the colonies is now butting up against used to be French, but now it's Spanish territory, so they're running into other countries' settlers, and also natives that really don't want us there, even compared to the natives we've already been fighting for decades, if not a century and a half now. So the British are now moving to properly garrison the North American colonies, and that takes money, so they're using these taxes to essentially garrison the colonies. So the Virginia House of Burgesses was led by Patrick Henry. He's one of the more radical members of our founding fathers. He wanted to oppose the Stamp Act. Let me make sure that my sound is on. Oops, wrong one. Okay, cool. Do you have a paper? You can turn it in at the end of class. It's no big deal. If you don't, you can email it. Don't worry about it. And then we had folks like the Sons of Liberty that were led by Samuel Adams, who were a bit more violent. Let me actually read this out of the book. Oh, they have this Vox Populi as well, if you're familiar with that term. Angry mobs throughout the colonies attacked stamp distributors. Some were beaten, others tarred and feathered, and all were forced to take an oath to never sell stamps again. Like these official... here we go. The protests turned violent in Boston, where the Sons of Liberty leaders like Samuel Adams organized mass demonstrations, spread anti-British sentiment. Where's the... Here we go. Sons of Liberty hung an effigy of stamp distributor Andrew Oliver on a tree, called for his resignation, mock funeral procession. Carried the fake corpse of the Boston Stamp Office to the Boston Stamp Office and destroyed the building. Saved pieces of lumber, stamped them, and set them on fire outside of Oliver's house. Oliver had already left town. His brother-in-law arrived at the scene and tried to quiet the crowd. They then destroyed his stable house, coach, and carriage. Attacked the house of Judge William Story, Customs Officer Benjamin Howell, and Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson. So, yeah, these weren't just like, hey, we're not happy with this thing that hasn't even happened yet. They were destroying property and, like, beating people. I asked this to my Tuesday, Thursday class, and I'm going to see if you guys get it a little bit quicker. What do we call a group that uses physical force to intimidate the government to get what they want? What's that? That's exactly right. Got it in one. Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty were a terrorist group. I mean, by definition, by the end of the Revolution, so were most of the Founding Fathers. But we won that, so therefore, I guess not. But, yeah, by definition, Samuel Adams was a freaking terrorist. Like, the tar and feather is shown in cartoons as being this silly thing. It's molten tar. It burns you. It sticks to you and, like, burns your skin. It's not just like a humiliation thing of, haha, you look like a chicken. You are being horrifically injured. So by the time the Stamp Act took effect, no agent was actually at their post because of the violence and intimidation that was being enacted upon them. The actual Stamp Act Congress, the protesters were pretty affluent. This is something we're going to see as we get into the actual revolution. The people who were actually running these protests were rich and saw these protests as ways to, saw these acts as cutting into their bottom line, and saw the protests as ways of recouping their losses. So they wanted that repealed, said taxation without representation was tyranny, which, fair enough. That said, there was, a whole ass Atlantic Ocean in between here and Parliament in England, so it would be rather difficult to send representatives from North America to England. There was some deal of common American identity within the colonies because, everybody's pissed about the Stamp Act. It wasn't just like a thing within certain regions of the colonies. Anyway, by 1766, the Stamp Act was repealed. So this proved that the colonies did have some degree of strength to affect the British government. But despite the aggression of certain groups, they still weren't pushing for, independence. They weren't, hey, we can do our own thing. Because Britain was the world's economy at the time, and not to mention also the most powerful military in the world. But even without the whole, we probably don't want to fight the world's most powerful military, there was also, we are part of the world's most powerful economy, and we probably don't want to just, abandon that. We just want a better place in that economy. Back where we were. That's the main thing. Is just we want things to be the way they used to be. We don't like all these new taxes that Britain's given us. And there's this real dramatic, like, oh, emblem of the effects of the stamp. Oh, the fatal stamp. It's like, guys, chill out. It's like a few cents. I mean, it wasn't just tarring and feathering. Here's some dudes pouring boiling water down the throat of one of the stamp officials. So, the good guys. And then the Stamp Act Congo is just a bunch of old dudes. Again, though, everybody did have a sword on them, because that was just the fashion of the day. All right. So things worked out for the protesters here, and then things continue to move along. Parliament passes the Declaratory Act that said they had the authority to pass any law to bind the colonies and peoples of North America closer to Britain, which is an interesting way of saying that Parliament has the right to do their job. I don't know. It's weird that they passed an act to say that they can continue to pass laws to do what they're supposed to do. I don't know. I mean, it's clearly like, we've got a bunch of stuff we're going to pass, and we're just going to pass a law that say we can pass these things. Anyway, June 1767, Charles Townshend came to power, again, Prime Minister. The Townshend Act, or Acts, was it? No, just Act, singular. Similar to the Sugar Act, taxed on certain items, glass, lead, paint, paper, tea. Again, technically luxury items. Lots of protests, but also specifically boycotts. Samuel Adams specifically led these boycotts because, he was in the middle of all of it. So the British sent 2 army regiments to enforce these new laws because the British were tired of dealing with it, I guess. Now, a specific mention here, and when I was doing this for my Tuesday, Thursday class, I got ahead of myself. Women were especially important in maintaining the boycott because they were typically the ones going out and buying the supplies for the household. So they had to ensure, let me see if I can read here. The boycott depended especially on the support of women who were often in charge of the day-to-day purchase of household items. Women were expected to boycott a wide array of British goods, gloves, hats, shoes, cloth, sugar, and tea among them. Single women and widows who supported themselves as shopkeepers were expected to join male merchants and store owners in refusing to sell British goods. To make up for boycotted goods, wives, mothers, and daughters produced homespun shirts and dresses and brewed herbal teas to replace British products. So there's quite a bit of that. And then we had this. Now you can't just take what happened without context. The Boston Massacre, 4 men were killed, including the ex-slave Crispus Attucks. One British soldiers fired into a routed crowd. It was a little more nuanced than that. There was like a single soldier standing there, and some kids were giving him shit, and then like a crowd showed up, including sailors from the nearby docks. One of the sailors was the ex-slave Crispus Attucks, and by this point the soldier was starting to feel quite outnumbered. More soldiers showed up to back him up. The crowd got more angry, started throwing rocks and stuff. Someone fired a shot. We're not sure who. You know, obviously, probably the British, but that is to say the Bostonians were probably also armed to somebody in the crowd was probably armed. Somebody probably had a flintlock pistol. But also, like, I could have a flintlock pistol right now, shoot, and it not hit anybody, because those things were inaccurate as hell. Anyway, the soldiers fired into the crowd. 4 men were killed. I think only 2 were killed outright, and then the other 2 died of their wounds later, because, again, muskets are inaccurate as hell. The Sons of Liberty turned this into the massacre that it is known as. Used the deaths as anti-British propaganda, turning the funeral into a parade around the city, and then the committees of correspondence spread this propaganda around the colonies. And in response to this, the Townshend duties were actually repealed, except for the tax on tea, because, as you know, American as we like to pretend that the colonists were at the time, they were still very British, and they wanted their tea, and the British officials knew that. So, like, okay, well, we'll take off the taxes except for tea, because we know you want your tea. And you'll pay the little tax to get your tea. Right, so slight deviation, but it's important for the next image I've got to bring up. We're all familiar with Paul Revere and his ride to warn Lexington and Concord about the incoming British. That actually comes up at the very beginning of the next chapter. However, obviously riding around and shouting at people in the middle of the night wasn't his day job. Does anybody know what his regular job was? Or does anybody want to guess what his regular job was? This was actually like a really important part of Bostonian society. Which makes it all the more surprising that he was the dude like riding through the woods in the middle of the night to warn about the British coming in. Because I didn't know until I was making these notes the first time. I'll give you a hint. He was an artisan. Everybody want to try? Fancier than a painter. Oh, what Paul Revere's day job was. Very important. Yeah, very high class. He knew a lot of judges, but it was an artisan job. Yep. He was a silversmith. This is a engraving printed and sold by Paul Revere of the Boston Massacre. This is on a silver plate, like a metal plate, not a plate. Yeah, Paul Revere was a silversmith, and needless to say, that takes a lot of training and a lot of money to be able to do. He was a very important member of society in Boston and had a lot of sway, which again is weird that like he was one of the people on horseback riding through the woods to warn about the British. He didn't have somebody else do it, which other people were involved in that. He actually got caught before he got to Concord, but other people had already gotten ahead of him. Which we'll get to. I'm getting ahead of myself. But the fact that this was by Paul Revere, I figured I'd mention it. Now, I mean, obviously, this wasn't how it looked originally. The paint has kind of run because silver works a little bit weird. The dog's kind of a blob down here. But, yeah, this is a silver engraving. All right. And I mean, I'm honestly not fussed if that was just a really good guess or if you looked it up, because Paul Revere being a silversmith is something I never would have guessed. It's like, I don't know what he did. Made horseshoes? No, he was fancy. All right. Now, despite all this, most of the resistance against the British was at the seaports, because that's where most of the commerce and economy was happening. So that's where most of the taxation was going on. A lot of other residents were more concerned about their colonial authorities. We saw the regulators in North Carolina. Governor Tryon in North Carolina claimed Parliament was abusing its power with the taxes, and then considered the regulators traitors when they questioned his taxes, speculators, politicians, employers, etc. So a year after the Boston Massacre, he sent troops to kill 20 regulators, injuring 100, and hanging 6 leaders. So, you know, the solidarity of Americans. So there's still more anti-authoritarian sentiment in America than there is anti-British sentiment. It's just that it's easy to see the British as the ultimate authority and turn against them. But depending on where you are, sometimes they're not the biggest concern. There was also a regulator branch in South Carolina. They showed up in 1767 and seized western portions of the colony, set up their own system of frontier justice. Basically, there were regions of western South Carolina, and again, when I say western South Carolina, I mean like maybe where Columbia is currently, maybe not even that far west. And people were living there, and they were under the taxation of, like, Charleston, because that was essentially the capital of the colony at the time. But they weren't receiving any protection from the colonial authorities. So, obviously, they were annoyed that they were having to pay into what the colony needed, but weren't getting any benefit from that. Because that's the point of taxes, is you're paying the government to essentially protect you or at least benefit you in some way. Um, so the regulators took over the western portions of the colony and essentially set up their own justice and protection. Um, Eventually, within 2 years, South Carolina Assembly negotiated a settlement with the regulators to extend representation to that region. So unlike with North Carolina, where they sent troops in to murder the regulators, in South Carolina, the Assembly was, I don't know if this is an accurate representation of what actually happened, but to me, it almost sounds like they were shamed into recognizing that the regulators were actually doing a better job of taking care of the colony than they were. And they're like, yeah, okay, we should probably do our job. So they worked with the regulators and extended representation to the rest of the colony and had, like, you know, protection and civil work and that sort of stuff further inland. Now, as far as North Carolinian regulators, since they weren't getting along so well with the governor, they often had to take supplies by force. They are capturing a powder escort. And as we're going to see later on, they also fought the British because, as I may have mentioned before, Herman Husband survived. Like, he wasn't one of the leaders who were captured and executed. He managed to get away, so he shows up later. All right, this is where I ended my Tuesday, Thursday class. I consider this next one to be probably the most British sounding slide I've got, at least for this class. Tea and widening resistance. So the British East India Company have been given a monopoly over tea distribution in the colonies. The British East India Company, or the BEIC, depending on where you're reading it from, they were not a good company. I mean, as we all know, monopolies are great. It doesn't cause any trouble. They, if I remember right, I think it was the BEIC, were the ones given control over India for a while, and then they royally screwed that up, and then Britain had to take control of India directly, and they didn't do a much better job. So the British East India Company was given control over the entire tea distribution in North America. So for the most part, boycotts and protests were how people responded. They refused to buy the tea, and in some cases, with like the merchants, refused to even sell it, so they wouldn't, essentially put it on their shelves. They'd leave it either in the back of the store or even in like the warehouse where it showed up in port. It's like, yeah, we're not even going to bring it to the building. Of course, if we're talking about tea before the American Revolution, we got to talk about the Boston Tea Party. So this famous act of vandalism, 55 men disguised themselves as natives, poorly, I might add, because it didn't throw off anybody, and dumped 45 tons of tea into the Boston Harbor. That's a lot of tea. And again, the native disguises was to have some level of plausible deniability. But the people in Boston knew who they were. But also the people in Boston weren't going to tell the British authorities anyway. Like, they could have gone out there with friggin' name tags on, and nobody in Boston would have said who it was. So, the British responded rather aggressively with the Coercive Acts. So, passing the next year, because I mean this was December of 1773, so this was like a few weeks later, the port of Boston was closed until the residents paid for the destroyed tea. They moved the Massachusetts court back to England, revoked the colony's charter, and approved a new quartering act to put soldiers in colonial homes, which, to make sure that the colonists were behaving. The moving the court to England and revoking their charter were incredibly big deals. I mean, the most visible was clearly like closing the port, which means essentially blockading it and keeping the people in Boston, and stationing soldiers. That's most visible. That's what's there. But closing the court, or moving the court and revoking the charter, way back when we had the Puritans settling Boston, and like they specifically brought all of the paperwork with them and created Boston as its own colony, not a colony of somebody in England. That was something new and different for a British colony. So the fact that Britain is now revoking all of that and reversing it was kind of a big deal. So the colonists called these the Intolerable Acts because, well, they refused to tolerate them. In case, you need a quick language lesson. And began arming themselves to prepare to resist the British. Now, this still isn't a move for independence, despite it sounding like it is. The idea of British colonists, I should say, arming themselves to fight against the British is pretty commonplace. Because, everybody hates the British, including the British, especially British colonists. You have some people from Britain leave Britain and stay somewhere for a little while, especially a couple of generations. They're going to end up not liking the British very much. So that's not unusual, which again is why the British don't react too strongly to, oh, they're arming themselves to fight back. Neat. Like, it's not unusual. It's something that happens really often in British history, especially between Britain and Ireland. And also even within the American colonies, there wasn't this push of the British have gone too far, we're going to declare independence. So after all of this, the coercive acts and whatnot, the Continental Congress met. The meeting of representatives from various colonies was meant to take place in September of 1774 in Philadelphia to figure all this out. Like, okay, things are moving too fast. We need to decide on how we're gonna straighten things out before the British just roll in and start shooting the place up. Oh, this picture wasn't in the next chapter. It's right here. This is how big the British Empire was. Like, sure, Britain is just this. I'm not going to include Ireland because Ireland was its own thing. Britain was just this. But the American colonies were just like this section over here, not even including Florida, because Florida wasn't even really settled yet. Um, they had Canada, not even all of that yet. Um, they had some of this in Africa. This is after the scramble for Africa. They had bits here. They had some stuff here in South America. I think they had some stuff down here too. The Falklands, for example. They had stuff here in the Caribbean. They had bits and pieces of, actually they had most of India. Not all of this, but most of it. They had bits and pieces out here in Southeast Asia. They had the majority of Australia, New Zealand, Tasmania. Also, I was going to say also islands out here in the Pacific, but that will be here. So yeah, Britain had a lot to concentrate on. And also, like, Ireland was rebelling every 15 to 30 years. So they had other stuff to concentrate on besides making sure that they taxed what was going on over here. You know, there was rebellions over here, and they had a lot of stuff going on down here. Actually, there were diamond mines down here, and a bunch of like Dutch settlers down here that had their own society that didn't want the British there. Don't even get me started on Australia. Don't even get me started on India. There was a lot going on. Like, they didn't have time to focus on North America. Anyway, there's always weird depictions of the Boston Tea Party. Here's one that's probably a little more accurate because it's showing actually large boxes, big crates being thrown over. Dudes with big axes to break open the boxes, which makes more sense. Even though, again, probably not the best disguises. And if you want to get really accurate, there you go. Thanks, Ubisoft. Got your India tea there in an itty bitty crate. They didn't even bother to like dress up the NPC. Anyway. And of course, the responses to Britain's response were very dramatic. The able doctor, or America swallowing the bitter draught, which was a common thing of just like pouring boiling water down people's throats. It's like, oh, this is helping. Then also this weird one of like the Bostonian citizens in a cage up in a tree, and there's like the blockade around Boston down here, and the other colonies would send supplies to the Bostonians, so here they are like giving them fish and like bread on sticks. It's a whole thing. Bostonians in distress. All right. "56 delegates went to Philadelphia's Carpenter Hall, representing every colony but Georgia. I don't recall if Georgia wasn't invited because it was not a whole lot of a colony, or if it was because Georgia was really far away and they didn't have the time to send somebody. Let me see. Does it actually say? Oh, no, it doesn't. It just says every colony but Georgia, and then just moves on. A lot of them knew each other. They had been working together with the Stamp Act and other petitions about Britain, so they had already worked together. But they didn't necessarily get along. They had differing views on how to do things. We had radicals like Samuel Adams. Oh, look, Samuel Adams is already here. Patrick Henry, who we had seen with the Virginia House of Burgesses. Christopher Gadsden, who we will never see again, but he's mentioned in the book, so I figured I'd just write him in here. We had folks like George Washington, and John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, who were more moderate, who wanted kind of a middle ground where it's like we probably don't want to antagonize Britain anymore, but also we need to make sure that they repay us in some way for what they've done to our people. And then there were conservatives like John Jay of New York who just wanted things to de-escalate before they got worse. New York ended up being like this loyalist holdout until the very end. And despite all this, and even with radicals like Samuel Adams, there still wasn't any talk of independence. They wanted to redress the grievances, as I said. They wanted Britain to pay in some way for what they had done, and I don't mean like revenge. I mean like literally pay the people of Boston for what they'd done to them, and in some way make up for what had happened. Return to former freedoms from taxes and British troops, and return to the economic and political rights that they had had before. That benign neglect that had been happening in the colonies for decades. So those who were now really running the resistance to these coercive acts were the elites of the colonies, not the regulators or the Green Mountain Boys or the average person. It was the rich, it was the elites, it was those who had quite a bit to lose and quite a bit to gain when it came to how the colonies would respond to this. But also, rather than it being a single colony dealing with Britain, so like, say, Boston or I guess Massachusetts as a whole, it was now a collective effort. It was now the Continental Congress, which represented most of the colonies, sorry Georgia, rather than it just being Boston on its own. We also got a really nice picture of Carpenter Hall. I always love me some pretty brickwork. And then inside, poor bastard having to dress up to give a history lesson. Not for me, man. Not that in American history. And then a quote by William Jennings Bryan, who we will sort of mention next semester. He doesn't come up a whole lot. He's not that important. But he does make an interesting quote here. Our government conceived in freedom and purchased with blood can be preserved only by constant vigilance. Thanks, William Jennings Bryan. All right. That's actually it for Chapter 5. Sugar Act in 1764, Continental Congress, 1774. The colonists had quite a bit to say about what Parliament was doing. And it went from little squabbles into the whole colonies resisting. But again, it should be shown that it wasn't just the colonies all rising together to fight the British. There was still plenty of disagreement within the colonies about, the average person against the colonial elites. And even as late as 1774, nobody was really pushing for independence from Britain. They wanted to kind of go back to how things had been, because again, Britain was the power to work with. They had the money, they had the military power, and being on their side was probably the way to go. It's just they were not a big fan of being the tax burden for Britain, or being the burden of taxes for Britain. Okay, we've got a bit of time left, so I want to at least start the next chapter. So let's do that. And it is called Revolutions. Because it's not just, the one. Well, we'll get to it. So, 75 to 83. It's actually a fairly long conflict. Well, the conflict itself doesn't take too awful long, but it takes forever to actually work out a peace. You will see that at the end. So, as we saw, the Bostonians had been preparing weapons to resist the British, and the British found out about it and began marching towards Lexington Concord to either capture or destroy these supplies of weapons. However, a number of the colonists had found out about this and went ahead to Lexington to warn the militia, Paul Revere being among them. Paul Revere, again, the silversmith. Paul Revere was actually stopped after Lexington and wasn't able to continue on, but there were other riders with him who did slip past the net and were able to warn Concord. So the local militia were comprised of folks known as Minutemen. If you weren't aware, I hope we all learned this in like first grade. They were known for the speed at which they could be ready. I made a joke to my Tuesday, Thursday class that like it took more than a minute to load a damn musket. I don't know how you could actually be ready in under a minute, but in all seriousness, if you could be ready to fight in the colonial times in like under an hour, you were doing really good. So to be ready in like less than 15 minutes, you were light speed. So the first shots of revolution were at Lexington. The British won this particular exchange and pushed the colonists back. They then got to Concord and destroyed a number of supplies. However, most of the supplies that they had been sent to destroy had been moved. So what Paul Revere and his other riders had set out to do was largely successful. However, let me just read this out of the book. The first shots ran out at Lexington. 8 colonists were killed in the initial skirmish. However, on the way back, patriots in nearby towns had been alerted, borrowing guerrilla tactics from Native Americans. Colonists hid behind trees, walls, and barns and battered the British soldiers as they marched back to Boston, killing 73 and wounding 200. Word of the conflict traveled quickly. Outraged Bostonians. Outraged Bostonians attacked British and forced them to retreat with their ships. British soon regained control of Boston. Colonial forces entrenched themselves in the hills just north of the city. In May, Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys from Vermont joined militias from Connecticut and Massachusetts to capture the British garrisons at Fort Ticonderoga in New York. So things had quickly, very quickly unraveled. Second Continental Congress met immediately after, because like, okay, we got to get this together and either stop it or control like the flow of what's happening. They were trying to figure out how to ensure time for discussion. Others argued that we're already in a shooting war. Independence is the only way to go. June 16th, Battle of Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill, led by General Sir William Howe. The British were technically victorious. However, they lost twice as many troops as the colonists. The colonists actually, again, reading from the book, the British won the day when Patriots ran out of ammunition. I'd say you're doing a pretty good job defending your location when you fight until you run out of ammo. So despite technically losing the Battle of Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill, because the colonists were able to inflict twice as many casualties on the British, it emboldened them to continue their push for independence. Because, I mean, sure, it's a loss, but the British certainly felt it. Also, there's Parvere, looking like a young Jack Black. And the Minutemen. Actually, the Minutemen. I love the quality of this one. Got back there, it's just like this. Right there, it's just like a blob. It's great. There's Bunker Hill. Keep firing until you're out of bullets. Well, they took that personally, and they did. Right. We'll continue, I guess, next week, because today's Wednesday, isn't it? Yeah. So yeah,